All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of Liberty Lens. I am your host, Big John, and today, as always, I'm joined by my co-host and friend, Mr. Mike Termat. And I made a promise to Mike, I'm going to shut up a little more this week and actually let someone who's knowledgeable talk. Mike, welcome to the show. Are you raring to go this week?
I am. It's great to be with you. You don't need to shut up. As a matter of fact, if you try too hard to shut up, I'm afraid you'll hurt yourself.
That's true.
So we don't want that. I do think it's fun and interesting that a whole bunch of days ago we talked about, we need to discuss Ukraine at some point. And in the interim, of course, in Riyadh, officials from Russia and the United States met person to person, face to face for the first time in over 3 years. So I don't know that they did that just because they wanted us to have plenty of material to discuss, but it certainly has worked out.
Absolutely. So the timing is perfect. As you said, we seem to have captured the zeitgeist today. We're going to talk about Ukraine, but we will get to all the current situation, what the Trump administration is doing, what the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, may be negotiating right about now, how Putin is reacting, Zelensky. But before we get to that, for those folks that may not be fully aware of libertarian positioning on something like the Ukraine war, let's take 2 to 3 minutes, Mike, I promise, and let's go through two things. One, what is the brief history of the Ukrainian war, how it started?
Starting from the Treaty of 1635, yes, go ahead.
Yes, in great detail with czars and stuff. But just how did this particular war start? And then why libertarians? What is the libertarian position on providing aid to foreign countries or a country that might be at war? So to start off, what is the beef between Putin and Zelensky?
To oversimplify, Putin and many Russians want Ukraine to be a part of the Russian Empire, and this is the important part, once again. And it's like the Middle East. If you start studying this any sooner than the last 5,000 years, you're really out of touch. To work backwards, the libertarian position is traditionally, though not uniformly, but libertarians traditionally and in the most part and in most cases believe that other people's wars are other people's wars.
Right.
And that war is a bad idea in general for the United States unless we're directly attacked. That's obviously an oversimplification, but that's where libertarians begin.
How is that different from isolationism, Mike? Make a distinction if you can.
Yeah, if I may. Isolationists are more comfortable with the United States taking care of itself for the sake of it. In other words, isolationists are comfortable with compromising free trade. Are comfortable sticking your head in the sand and not recognizing that we do have interests in stability outside of our borders.
Right.
Whereas I think a modern libertarian recognizes that the United States economically, culturally, and in terms of security has an interest in maintaining stability outside of our borders. It just isn't a matter that, over which we should be going to war.
Right.
Nor should we be throwing literally in the case of Ukraine, hundreds of billions of dollars into prolonging a war, which does not seem to have resulted in a whole lot of value that we wouldn't have gotten if we had negotiated an end to this war a long time ago, or, as we will discuss, avoiding the war altogether. Ukraine much of Ukraine is ethnically Russian, culturally Russian, and in the eastern regions, in the Donbass, which is to say a highly industrialized area, Russian is the dominant language, especially in the urban areas. And that is important to recognize, not only because there are any number of people there who are comfortable with the idea of Ukraine being a part of the Russian Empire, but it creates a bond with the Russian people and an excuse for imperialists like Vladimir Putin to, try to incorporate part or all, which is his inclination, all of Ukraine in the name of, cultural sanctity. And, he is going to use, he's going to continue to use language like liberating the Russian people of Eastern Ukraine. When it's important, I think, for us to bear in mind that Putin has an interest in maintaining a Russian empire per se, just, the idea that Russia should be a major player in the world, should be one of 2 or 3 nations that makes the rules whereby which the rest of the world needs to conduct themselves.
Right.
He believes that Russia was traditionally an empire and therefore should be going forward. I think that that's how he defines success. I don't think he defines success in terms of GDP or certainly not in terms of the classically liberal lifestyles of his citizens, right? This is not how he defines success. And that's important to remember. Ukraine is a particular target to bring into a would-be Russian empire, like Belarus is probably an example. But Ukraine is a particular target, not only because of the cultural connections, but the historical connections. Ukraine was, of course, a part of the Soviet Union until 1991, when it became independent. And that was a problem for Russia, not only because of the loss of what people like Putin might view as an empire, but because it also cut off Russia's ability to access the Black Sea through the Crimea as an important naval base. And if you are hell-bent on dominating part of the world, that is not unimportant, right?
Right.
And so there are all these reasons why Ukraine has been a particular target. Ukraine was not incorporated into NATO at the time, which left it hanging out there. The United States participated in pressuring Ukraine to give up nuclear weapons, thinking that that would enhance security. There is certainly an implication from Washington, not a treaty, but there is an implication from Washington that it would help participate in maintaining security for Ukraine. By the way, all of that does suggest that if there's not a treaty in place, you really ought to think twice about what politicians, whether they're coming from Washington or anywhere else, are saying to you that's going to make you feel warm and fuzzy about your future security.
Right.
So,
and the one thing because you touched on it, another sticking point has been that Putin sees Western aggression in trying to recruit Ukraine into NATO, because he views that as an expansion of Western borders at the same time that Russia's empire, as he sees it, is
absolutely,
right?
and not illogically. I mean, there is some logic there. We're going to say some things that recognize the logic of Putin's position. I would hate for someone to misinterpret that as an excuse to invade Ukraine. That's not where we're going. But there is some put yourself in his frame of reference as an imperialist, as someone who's willing to spend all kinds of treasure to leave a legacy of a Russian empire. Put yourself in that frame of reference and fast forward all the way to 2014, when the European Union and Kyiv are negotiating a free trade agreement that looks pretty good. As culturally Russian as some of Ukraine is, the majority of Ukraine consider themselves to be culturally and ethnically Ukrainian.
Right.
And looking toward Europe for a long, long time, increasingly so since 1991. So by the time the European Union comes knocking on the door with what is in effect A, a free trade agreement, and B, a stepping stone perhaps to a defense alliance. Maybe it's not NATO, but rhymes with NATO, and eventually it's going to feel like NATO, right? Because once you have a free trade agreement in place, you've got interests that are worth fighting for. So,
Right.
and Russia steps up to the, good for them, steps up to the plate with what a lot of people in Kyiv thought was an even better deal, including direct investment and a lending package, which today doesn't sound massive, $15 billion. But in those days, that was a significant amount of money, especially in a place like Kyiv that was remained relatively underdeveloped, mostly, ironically, because of the Soviet Union, but we digress. And the president decides he's not signing the European Free Trade Agreement that they had been negotiating for so long, thinking he's going to get a better deal from the Russians. This does bring up how much influence there had been. Was he on the take? Was there either a proverbial or even a literal gun to his head in declining the European Union's deal? He puts it off. And of course, that prompts what eventually turns into a revolution. And he is removed from power. He winds up, not coincidentally, being protected by the Russians. No one was surprised by that, but does cast everything he had done over the previous 2 years into a completely different light, and correctly so, I believe.
And this was the guy prior to Zelensky. I can't recall his name right now.
Two guys prior to Zelensky, that's right.
Who were pro-Russian. Zelensky ends up,
he was pro-Russian, he was pro-development, but he was not as pro-Russian as Moscow wanted, and not as anti-Russian as 2/3 of Ukrainians wanted. So he was in a bit of a pickle, and that's how people lose power, and so he did.
So libertarians, to me, I think, depending on your range of libertarianism, might be confused at this point, Mike, because on the one hand, you have, hey, Putin has every right to protect his nation's sovereignty, to identify Russians as Russians, not to be part of any collective. The irony, of course, is he wants to now re-annex the Ukraine, and you've got the Ukrainian people saying, hey, we don't want this for the most part.
Right.
We don't want this. And here, like even in the U.S., you have libertarians who are like, secession, yay. If Texas wants to secede, they should have the right to. And the United States would be wrong to try to keep Texas in the U.S. if Texas or even New Hampshire to make it relevant to libertarians, right? But yet those same libertarians find fault with Ukraine and seem to be siding with Putin. Not everybody, but I'm saying there is that faction that sees it that way. So libertarians are a little, like most Americans, I think, are a little bit all over the map on this one.
I think that's right, possibly for different reasons than a lot of Americans are all over the place on this one.
Yes.
I think it's important to recognize that just like Texas, where most Texans want to stay in the United States, it's true. Most Scottish want to stay in the United Kingdom. Most of the Spanish, even if they speak Castellano, want to remain part of the ostensible Kingdom of Spain.
Right.
But there are people who feel differently, and it turns out most Ukrainians don't want to be part of Russia. And it turns out that Putin has deeply ulterior motives. This isn't about protecting the cultural dignity of Russian-speaking Ukrainians. He needs a Black Sea port. He wants a Russian empire, per se, just for the sake of it. And he doesn't want NATO coming to his borders, as you point out, which is the most logical piece that we can at least best understand, not being in his particular frame of reference. So, it blew up. He used it as an excuse to take Crimea. The Obama administration decided not to do anything about it. The United States citizenry was split on that fact. Nobody wanted to go to war over Crimea with Russia, nor did the Europeans, by the way.
Right.
And that led to more than a skirmish, but less than an all-out war in eastern Ukraine that lasted many years until 2022, when there was the full-scale invasion almost exactly 3 years ago, after Russia had mounted all kinds of troops for weeks and weeks and weeks on the Ukrainian border, and no one was able to negotiate away Putin's interest in invading Ukraine for a number of reasons, including, I believe, false hope that he wouldn't pull the trigger, an unwillingness to promise not to incorporate Ukraine into NATO,
Right.
an unwillingness to play ball with Putin in a number of other ways. And so here we are. The
Right.
prediction at the time was that war would, take 3 weeks, that the Russian army would drive to Kyiv, that it would install a puppet government, and that would be over. Attacking from Russian territory and attacking from Crimea, the resources that the Russian army would be able to bring to bear, the United States and importantly some European nations, mostly Poland, but not solely Poland, including Germany, threw in resources to make it punishing and difficult. But as it turned out, a couple of things turned out to be true. It was harder than I think Putin anticipated.
Yeah.
The resources that the West were able to provide were more effective. I think in large measure, this illustrated the difference in technology between the West and the Russian army. It turned out that the Russian army, I'm sorry if this sounds simplistic, but just wasn't that good at this, right? Did not bring enough resources to bear, disregarding the Colin Powell doctrine of bringing overwhelming force and making
Right.
sure that even if you screw something up, you're going to come out victorious. And they got stalled and hunkered down, and the casualties mounted.
Yep.
I think that people were surprised, not surprised that it went into the thousands, but were surprised when it got into the tens of thousands. And now no one has a good count, but no one would deny the idea that we're well into the hundreds of thousands of lives lost and casualties.
Yeah, let me jump in there real quick. I was trying to do some research on those numbers, and it turns out that through the end of 2024, December 31st, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, so take that with a grain of salt.
They try. They
try. So this is probably an underestimation, if anything, but the numbers they provided was 12,500 civilian deaths, 28,000 injured civilians, military casualties. We have 45,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed. We have, according to the Russian military, which again is a little bit harder to get numbers than the Ukrainian military, but independent media estimates suggest somewhere between 138,000 to 200,000 Russian soldiers killed. So whereas Putin and I think most of the world expected a cakewalk here, Mike, the typical American solution to problems of throwing tons of money at something seems to have at least made this a ball game. I mean, not to use flippant
it did make it sporty.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it was the technological difference that the Russians just had not anticipated, perhaps because they did not expect so much Western cooperation. Maybe they didn't understand the difference in technologies. Putin eventually sent Prigozhin in with the special forces, and they decided that was looking like a bad idea and didn't get the backup from Moscow that they wanted. And when some of them turned around, Putin interpreted that as insolence and misbehavior that could not be tolerated, and Prigozhin was executed in traditional Russian fashion of not having your fingerprints on it.
Yeah. So let's now. So that sets the stage of how the war kind of started, where the conflicting interests are and how libertarians should view it, which again, we've admitted is complicated. You're not getting 2 bullet points out of it, right?
Right.
From the US point of view, where libertarians, I think all of us can agree, is the amount of tax resources, the theft that the government engages in.
Taxation is theft, John.
Taxation is theft, Mike. I think I've heard that somewhere. And how much of it is being sent to aid Ukraine. So let me just throw numbers quickly at you, and I'm keeping an eye on the clock to make sure we don't get boring here. Total allocated funds, 183 billion. This is U.S. towards Ukraine. Obligated funds, 130 billion. Dispersed funds, and here's the key number, just shy of 87 billion. So there's 50 billion that have been allocated but not dispersed. In January of this year, Biden, on his way out the door, announced a final military aid package of about 500 million to Ukraine. As of January 9th, military assistance provided for almost 3 years, since February 22, stood at 65.9 billion, so 66 billion. Trump has announced, hey, we're ending this. Anything that was headed to Ukraine via US AID, that's been shut off. And as of today and yesterday, these are late-breaking developments, Mike. We have Marco Rubio directly trying to negotiate something. We also have Trump, who issued what I would consider a very insulting tweet towards Zelensky, saying, like, if it wasn't for Trump, you know how he likes to capitalize his name and put it in quotes. The quote part is the part I don't understand. But anyway, that only Trump can save them and Trump can negotiate a good deal. Parentheses, if Zelensky is willing to let the U.S. get at Ukraine's natural resources. That was part of the tweet. So take all this, Mike, put it in a blender, spin it up.
I think it helps. I think 2 different contexts help understand where this is going to go. One is the Russians view this as a good thing because they believe they're going to come out with a pretty good deal.
Right.
It's not nearly as embarrassing as where they have been the last year. They are going to be able to claim some sort of victory and a bit of a stepping stone toward claiming that they are, maybe not claiming out loud, but in their minds, they'll be able to feel like they are an imperialist nation, which to them is a good thing. As Americans, we should consider that to be a bad thing, even if it were us, which is a whole nother conversation that we maybe next week we'll discuss. And importantly, Russia wants to feel like they are the big player in that part of the world. And so just the idea that there's a conversation going on, negotiation going on between the United States and Russia that excludes Zelensky, the Ukrainians, and the rest of the Europeans makes Russia feel more important and like one of the 2 power players that controls all of the world that China doesn't control. So this is a good win for Russia. They feel very good about where this is going, and that's a very important context. The other important context is, from the standpoint of the Trump administration, they too like to feel like they're the ones calling the shots,
right?
That they don't need Zelensky or the Ukrainians or the Europeans weighing in. I think the administration is very comfortable having excluded them from these conversations up until now. Now, the negotiation has only been very, very preliminary. It's really a pre-negotiation. And
right.
So it may well be that the Ukrainians and the Europeans are included in the next round of conversation, which in Riyadh yesterday was between Rubio and Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. They also had their emissary there, and we sent just the team of 3. So it was the 5 of them in the conversation. Future rounds will likely include representatives of the other interests. But this does bring up, this will become a flashpoint toward a new relationship between the United States and Europe. There's no doubt about that. And we need to keep in mind that this is related to J.D. Vance being in Germany just the other day, lecturing the Europeans, not only that they need to step up and do more in terms of their own self-defense. By the way, go back a number of years, they agreed to step up to 2% of GDP in defense spending. That's a pretty shy number, considering the United States was well over 4% for a long time and is still well over 3%. And a lot of that is to protect Europe. And so the United States, I believe correctly, you don't have to be a libertarian, correctly resents the idea that the Europeans have been largely under 2% in terms of how much money they spend on self-defense. So Vance is over there lecturing them once again, as Trump had done many years earlier, that they need to spend more money, but also, and I cannot overstate the importance. Vance lectures them that what they have to fear, my words, not his, their greatest threat is their own fear of their citizenry, their loss of democratic principles by suppressing conversations. Granted, his admonition regarding censorship would ring more clearly to a libertarian if the Germans and others were suppressing left-wing voices instead of right-wing voices, right? Because there any number of people look at that Vance lecture and say, well, JD, you're upset because the Europeans are suppressing voices on the right. Whereas if he had the opportunity to complain about censorship of voices on the left, he would have really sounded like a libertarian, because he himself is on the right. But he doesn't have that opportunity. I believe that he is probably, notwithstanding the fact that he's on the right, I think that he's probably correct that the Europeans do need to look in the mirror and say, are we doing everything we can to remain the classically liberal democracies to which we aspire? Because, not just because it's the right thing to do, because Mike Tremont said so, because I'm a libertarian, but also because, and here's Vance's bottom line, you won't be able to do anything for yourselves if you lose your democratic principles. You won't be able to help America, and America won't be able to help you. Think about it. Not only is that, from a practical standpoint, an important statement for a continent that is dependent on the United States for defense protection, a continent of folks who have refused to spend 2%, and some have stepped up. I don't want to suggest that we need to forget Poland, which is over 4% in defense spending today, more than the United States in relative terms. Not only is an important statement as a practical and pragmatic matter, but think of it in terms of overall ethics. If the nature of our relationship is our shared value system, if that's why we're all in, it's not ethnic heritage. We have free trade with a lot of the rest, semi-free trade with a lot of the rest of the world. It can't just be about economics anymore either. If the reason we're standing with Europe is our shared democratic values, and now you're compromising those democratic values, what do we have? What are we doing here? Why are we transferring all of this value in defense spending on your behalf when you don't want to step up to the plate and spend money? You don't want to protect what we would call the First Amendment, free speech, right? And now you've got a big conflict with Russia. I'm sorry, but the Trump administration, when it suggests, you know what, we're bringing this to a close, we're not just pouring money down the drain, it's hard, even as a libertarian, it's hard for me to look at the Europeans and say, oh, I really feel bad for you people.
Right. Help
Look, if
yourselves.
you want to step up to the plate, if you really believe that notwithstanding what we've learned over the last 3 years about the Russian army's inability to even drive its way to Kyiv, right? But
Right.
if you want to remain paranoid of the Russian army, I'm not telling you what to do. You can read my tone of voice. But if you really want to remain paranoid of the Russian army, then you do you. Then
Right.
go ahead and spend 3.5% of your GDP on defense. Man up and protect your continent. But do not compromise your democratic principles and then say the United States has to step up and be the guarantor of your security because you don't want to spend enough money. And what we believe that means is keeping Russia out of Russian-speaking areas in Ukraine. That is a big lift for a farmer in Missouri.
Agreed. And Mike, I think what you just said, I was going to say most libertarians, but most people would tend to agree with you, right? We're not saying like, hey, if there's a flood, we don't want to send money to help victims, or some might, but most of us, I think, are not at that point, right?
Right.
But do you feel, and I'll wrap it up on this, I'll let you wrap it up on this one. Do you feel that the Trump or the Vance, you mentioned Vance in Germany, do you feel that that message may be missing its mark when it's coupled with what many consider American overtures towards imperialism, the annexation of Greenland, the annexation of Canada? So when you look at it, you're like, hey, Trump is right. Why should we spend twice as much as what Europe spends to defend itself? And at the same time, they don't share our ideals of democracy. And I use quotes because everybody's version of that is different. But we know that they're more restrictive than us, right? When it comes to speech, when it comes to other liberties, right? So, but at the same time, the guy who's saying, we're not going to give you money for that reason, and we agree with you on that, hey, Canada's looking pretty good as a 51st state. Hey, Greenland would really look good in red, white, and blue because, by the way, we need it as a strategic military point. We need it as a strategic natural resource. So give me your wrap up on that. Why should libertarians distinguish, compartmentalize the two, or should they, Mike?
I don't think they should. I think we should be pushing the Trump administration to be as honorific of our democratic principles as possible. That doesn't necessarily imply our democratic institutions,
Right.
which are kind of a mess. I think our principles need to trump our institutions. But it's why, to your point, we believe that the Trump administration needs to do a better job of articulating what types of relationships, not just what types of transactions, we are seeking, not just in Europe, but around the world. I'm reminded of why it was that Nixon was able domestically politically, able to reach out to China. Why is it that the United States citizenry tolerated him being the guy to reach out to China? Well, of course, it was because he had a long resume of bona fides of being a anti-communist,
right,
red fighter, and so he was the right guy. No one mistook Reagan for being pro-left when he was trying to cut a deal with Gorbachev, trying hard to cut a deal with Gorbachev. If you want to be the guy cutting a deal with the Russians, I believe you need to build up your political capital in terms of your adherence to democratic principles. And so I wish that, and we're early in this administration, so I will remain optimistic that,
sure,
they'll get their rhetorical footing. But I wish that they were doing a better job of talking about how wonderful it is to have the relationships that we do with such strong democracies. Canada and the United Kingdom being leaders. I'm a big believer that the first trips that an American president needs to make are to Canada and to the United Kingdom. If it is true, as I believe this administration at least believes that it is, that the Pacific is going to be the most important region to our security in the future, and that the so-called Quad, with importantly including India, whose leader was just the United States, kudos to the White House. I thought that was a real important discussion, but also Australia and Japan. If you believe that that is important, as I do, I think the Trump administration does, those are democratic leaders to which he should be reaching out, praising their democratic principles, our shared values.
Right.
And maybe this is a J.D. Vance job. If you're going to lecture the Germans on censorship, maybe your next trip is to Australia and lecture those people about censorship, the internet, right?
Right.
COVID,
Gun
lockdowns.
rights. They have no gun rights in Australia at all.
They have no gun rights, or free speech rights. That is a good place to lecture, because if you're going to make that case, it can't be just about Europe, because and it can't just be about censoring right-wing voices, right? You've got to put on your big boy libertarian pants and make the case, no, we support democratic principles and classical liberal values all over the world, not just when we're mad at the Europeans for being cheap.
Right. And on that note, I will say I agree with you what you said. And I think we mentioned it when it came to tariffs. I think we mentioned it on a lot of things when it comes to the Trump administration, that even if you think the policy is good, the way it's presented sometimes, it's like serving somebody a nice steak, but you serve it on the garbage can lid. It's like the presentation matters. It's not just what's the steak, right? It's like how it appears, how appetizing
it does matter, because it sends the signal to the people whom you need in your coalitions.
Right,
exactly. You can trust us to continue going in a certain direction, or, by the way, this is bullshit for this reason. We're just saying this. You need certain people to come along with you. And a lot of those politicians you need on your side are sensitive to their own, domestic politics. They're sensitive to compromising their own values. And so you need to give them an on-ramp that makes sense for them politically.
All right, Mike, 1 minute wrap up, and then we'll end the show. Where do you see the U.S. Financial aid to Ukraine, say, being by the end of 2025? And then
shut down completely. And I think it'll be a lot. I think it'll be completely in terms of military assistance. I think that there will be developmental assistance. Absolutely. I agree with you that the White House is going to be looking for concessions from Ukraine in terms of resources. There's going to have to be something in it for the United States economy. I think that's just how the Trump administration thinks. I think a lot of Americans will be okay with that, by the way, depending on how those deals are cut. Maybe we should be okay with it. I think that the Ukrainians are going to be forced to cede some of the Donbass, possibly all of it.
Right.
I think that the United States is probably going to end up recognizing Crimea as a legitimate part of Russia. I think that there will be trade barriers and sanctions lowered for Russia to do business with the United States, and possibly by implication with some of our allies. In other words, I anticipate this being an excellent deal for Russia, arguably too good. I think that economically that'll be fine, what there is to worry about is, will the Europeans step up? I think that we need a number of changes in European leadership. There are just too many persons in power, both in terms of the European Union Parliament and individual parliaments of European nations. There are just too many people in power that are wed historically to the idea that we're not going to spend a lot of money. It's the United States obligation to protect us. So I worry how that goes. Russia has already said they will not tolerate European troops in Ukraine keeping the peace. I don't know what that implies, but I think we do need to worry about, in the long run, Russia wanting the rest of Ukraine, and the signal this sends to the Russians, if they get too good a deal about, maybe they come back for a fourth bite of the apple, in another few years. I don't know how long Putin is going to be in power, but if the deal is too good for Russia, what it means is that positive signal to Moscow will outlast Putin. Whoever replaces him will look back and say, well, even if it doesn't go perfectly, we're going to get a good deal out of it. So bottom line, I believe that the Trump administration needs to find a way to convince Moscow that it is never going to control Kyiv, and at the same time send the signal to the Europeans that the Marshall Plan is over. We're not here to protect your economy or to bolster it or to help you minimize your defense spending anymore. And the Cold War is over too. That the United States Pentagon is no longer in business to maintain your paranoia of the Russian army.
Fair enough. And I want to say this has been an excellent history lesson in half an hour. So I appreciate that too. We even managed to work in the phrase from when I was a child, Mike, when both of us were children, that you always used to hear on the news, only Nixon could go to China. Only Nixon could go to China. That was a phrase that was used. And there you go. You worked it into the conversation. So kudos to you, Mike. For everyone out there, this has been another episode of Liberty Lands. Catch us every Thursday on all the major platforms, X, YouTube, Rumble, Facebook. Until next week, when we'll have another topic to focus on. This has been Big John, along with my friend and co-host, Mike Maat. Peace, everyone.